Thank you, Donald. Well, yesterday, remember, a 29-year-old called Sally Carter from Birmingham drove a Ford Fiesta into the barriers outside Parliament. He's been picked up by the police and he is now a suspect in an investigation as to whether this was a terrorist act or not. I have to say, whether it was or whether it wasn't, it was pretty low grade, I am pleased to say. Of course, what the police are trying to find out now is who were his links and associations, and we know that 3 addresses in Birmingham have been raided by the police. I am one of those people who was warned for many, many years that unless we're very careful about who we let in, we face the risk, the increased risk of terrorism. And yet yesterday, I thought, was a very, very low-grade offence. I was astonished to see streets closed, screens up around the car in Westminster, helicopters flying in the air. I thought the response, frankly, was a little bit OTT. But, of course, none of that will stop our elders, betters and leaders from suggesting that something must be done. Earlier on today, here was Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, discussing whether he thought, in response to this attack and others, Parliament Square should now be closed to traffic and pedestrianised.
I've been a long-time advocate of pedestrianising Parliament Square. There were plans, of course, in the past from Ken Livingstone to pedestrianise Parliament Square. Boris Johnson cancelled those plans. It was in my manifesto to bring these plans back on board, and actually what's accelerated my desire to do so is what we saw last March on Westminster Bridge. There's a group set up which involves the Palace Westminster, which involves Westminster Council, City Hall, but also the police and security experts, see how we can pedestrianise Parliament Square sooner rather than later, taking on board our concerns to make sure it doesn't look like a hostile environment. Well,
there we are. Sadiq Khan happy to stop the traffic outside Parliament, to, as I see it, fly the white flag of surrender to terrorism. I'm not for it. And then the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, well, she took a more measured approach, but still, I think you can hear from her tone of voice, she'd be perfectly happy to stop cars going around Parliament Square.
As with anything, there is a balance to be drawn. Vehicles are on our streets all the time. We have crowds on our streets as well. The terrorists want us to completely change our way of life. They want us to be afraid, and they want us to stop doing what we want to do to lead a normal life in the UK. We're not going to give in. We're not going to just change our lifestyle, but it is important that we take reasonable measures, as I think we have been doing over the last several months, to try to make sure that the most iconic sites, including those in central London, are well protected, and should something happen there, that the police are able to respond very quickly with armed officers, which is exactly what you saw yesterday.
Well, the police responded with armed officers very quickly yesterday. That would have happened regardless whether it was pedestrianised or not. She took a more measured approach, but Sadiq Khan, I mean, Frank, I'm sorry, this is pathetic. We don't give in. We don't push forward demands, in my opinion, to pedestrianise Parliament Square because some nut job drives a Ford Fiesta into the barriers outside Parliament. I'm not saying we shouldn't take precautions, and very interesting, when I talked about in the European elections of 14 and on, I talked about tough immigration controls. People said, oh, Nigel, really? We really need to build bridges, not walls. Well, actually, on many of our bridges in the city now, we've built walls on those bridges as precautions to stop pedestrians from simply running in and knocking people over. But I don't think we should give in too far. I think we need to, personally, I believe we should be a lot more robust in standing up to terrorism and saying, 2 fingers up, we're not changing our way of life too much because of the likes of you. And I think that Sadiq Khan has given way too much today, and I wish the Met Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, had been firmer too. That is where I stand. I'm asking you, do you think pedestrianising Parliament Square is the right step forward for our safety, or is this, as I believe, giving in to terrorists? And if you think, no, Nigel, really, grow up, this just makes good practical sense, we have to do it, call 0345 6060 973. Or if, like me, you think, why not fly the white flag over Parliament? Maybe even the ISIS one. Then text to 84850. And maybe you think, do you know what? we've got enough security measures in place in London already, including, police with machine guns and things we wouldn't have even dreamt of 5 years ago. If that's how you feel, tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course, as ever, watch us on Facebook and comment there too. Would it be right, in the light of what happened with a crazed madman driving a Ford Fiesta, I mean, he could have chosen something bigger, couldn't he, really, into those barriers and getting nowhere, is it right for us to start changing the way central London operates? And folks, you may not live in London, but this principle applies to all of you as well, it seems to me. Let's go to Paul, who's a brand new caller from Deal in Kent, my favourite town in the whole of England. Paul, how are you?
I'm very, very well. It's lovely and sunny here as well. First time I've actually spoken to you, so it's a pleasure.
No, I'm delighted. I have to say, I'm very jealous of you. I love Deal. Kent is underrated in many ways. It's a lovely town.
Well, it's the best seaside town to live in the UK, by the way.
And now you've got a pedestrianised high street, of course, which won High Street of the Year 3 years ago, and I know it very well. I know many of the establishments along that high street. And I do understand there are arguments for pedestrianising, arguments that actually, mums with kids, don't want the worry of traffic and the risk. And I get all that. But, Paul, would it really make sense to stop the traffic in Parliament Square after what happened yesterday?
No, not at all. I'm really against it. And when I listened to Sadiq then, and on Good Morning Britain this morning, I think there's a hidden agenda there with that bloke. I mean, he's been trying to do this for years, and now he's got the ammunition to want to do it, and he's using the incident, which is pathetic, and I agree with you, in Parliament yesterday on Millbank, to fast forward the pedestrianisation. And all you're going to do, I mean, it's a congested area already along Millbank, so now you're going to move the goalpost, put all the traffic onto Albert Embankment, having to use Lambeth and Westminster Bridge, make the traffic even worse in London, which also he is against. And everyone's going around, everyone's banging that drum. Theresa May saying they will not win. Well, they've won. If you pedestrianise Parliament, they've won. And the security there at the moment works.
Paul, tell me, do you drive in London much?
I'm a bus driver.
Right, OK. Well, that answers my question, doesn't it?
And I drive coaches in London as well.
Has, in your view, the traffic got noticeably worse anyway in the last few years?
100%. I mean, Sadiq Khan has done his best to try and stop tourism. I know we've digressed it, but Coach Park in London's become an absolute pain. There's not many spaces left to able to park. And taking a coach around London, whether you're a commuter coach or a tour coach, it just takes forever. And the minute that superhighway came on the embankment, was a nail in its coffin.
Paul, don't. I go from Westminster to the city quite regularly. I can't get the underground because, the sort of extremists would like to beat me up. So I have to go by car. It now takes me an hour to go the 3 miles to the City of London because there's this huge cycle lane that no one's in. But that's a different question, Paul, for a different evening. So for now, on this question, do you agree with me that this is pandering to terrorism?
Absolutely, 100%. And Millbank's already been reduced in size to one lane each way.
It has, yeah.
And now, and now making it completely, or the possibility to make it completely pedestrianised is just going to upset more Londoners. And, a clever terrorist, the one done yesterday was far from clever. What he was trying to achieve, God only knows. And then all this big song and dance, the police were there in minutes.
But they would have been anyway.
They're there anyway.
They're there anyway with guns. Thank goodness. And after what happened last year, with PC Palmer being stabbed, I'm not surprised. Paul, you're a star. Thank you very much. Singh says to me, Nigel, this is a white flag to terrorism. Nigel, apart from being clear, unconditional surrender, we will eventually need to pedestrianise all of London and perhaps the whole country, says Solomon, all the way from Jerusalem. Well, Solomon, I have to say, I really find Sadiq Khan's words unbelievable. But maybe Toby from Reading will put me straight. Good evening, Toby.
Good evening to you, Nigel. No, I think on this occasion, it's one of few times I agree with Sadiq. And I think it's really, really pragmatic. And just think of it more as you have a lawn, lots of people keep stepping onto it. I know this is far more serious, But you just build a little fence, a little picket fence. You can do it very tastefully. You can paint it green, white, whatever colour you want. In this case, I think it's also good because there are so many tourists around there, and it's always chock-a-block.
All right, okay, Toby, I get it. So what about Buckingham Palace?
Yeah, so I think the big landmarks, as I said, you can do this tastefully.
Fine. So we stop the traffic in Parliament Square. We agree we stop the traffic at Buckingham Palace. What about Regent Street?
You know far more about London than
I do, Toby. I mean, all I'm saying to you is that if your argument is that we pedestrianise and make safer places with great London landmarks, my argument is to you, Toby, there are a lot of great London landmarks.
Yes, so you have to be selective, but for example, Houses of Parliament, you have all the MPs, and there's a lot of power that sits there. So I think there in particular, there's a very good argument for doing it. I don't think it's pandering to anyone. And just as an example, I mean, I used to go out of my house and not lock the door. Would be gone for hours. Nowadays, I have to, because things do change. And I think more important than this is we need to look at why is it happening and how do we resolve those issues.
Toby, on the big picture I agree with you, but as far as yesterday is concerned, this was one nut job, all right? If this was a terrorist attack, it was a pretty minor one. I know one lady on a bicycle got very badly injured. I'm sorry about that. I'm not demeaning that, but surely we're overreacting with the Mayor of London today calling for pedestrianisation.
Sorry. Whoops.
Hello?
Yeah, I agree. But imagine if it had been a lorry, Nigel.
Yes, it could have been, and that's why, Toby, we built barriers. That's why we got precautions. That's why we got armed policemen. Look, I get the point. London needs to be safe, but I think this is a step too far. It's my view. Toby, I thank you for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:15. Surely we're not going to knee-jerk because a 29-year-old who came to this country from Sudan and was naturalised here, who clearly had something very badly wrong with him, drives a Ford Fiesta into the barriers outside the House of Lords, and the Mayor of London is saying we need to pedestrianise Parliament Square. I mean, surely there's something pretty crazy about this. Surely this is the white flag of surrender. Why don't we stand firm? Tell me I'm wrong. 0345 6060 973. Ted from Southend says this is about protecting MPs, not the public. Take away the roads. How will the emergency services get there? Ted, they would, I think. Why should our politicians have more protection than the whole of the British people? There's quite a lot of this coming through. Who are these thick MPs that want to make Parliament Square pedestrian only? Do they think terrorists can't walk? Great tweet. Love it to death. So, they are proposing to move a problem from Parliament Square to somewhere else. What a great solution, says Paul in the West Midlands. And I get a green comment here. What about the environment? Think about the cleaner air in Parliament if it was pedestrianised. Well, you could just ban cars from London, I suppose. That'd make the whole thing much, much easier. Look, we're giving in, folks, here. I know the threat of terrorism is there. Nobody has talked about it or warned about it more than me, particularly since huge numbers of people came across the Mediterranean into Europe. It's one of the reasons I thought Brexit was the safer thing to do. But I think we're probably somewhat overreacting today. That is my view. What does Richard in Sidcup make of this great debate? Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. I think it's a terribly depressing situation when you've got a Mayor of London who's an advocate of open borders, who then wants to design the London architecture and landscape around the terrorism that's being too readily imported into this country. It's going to completely change everything. Well, what's it going to look like in 10 years' time? As you say, what's going to happen if they start going into Whitehall, Buckingham Palace, parts of Oxford Street? What are we going to do?
Oxford Street, Richard, Regent Street, I mean, Piccadilly Circus, I mean, Leicester Square, where we are right now. I mean, all of these things, all of these images of London are iconic in their own way, aren't they?
They are, Nigel. But unfortunately, it's not just London. If you look at the Eiffel Tower now, there's bulletproof glass around. Not barriers to prevent cars smashing into them. Yeah. Bulletproof glass around the Eiffel Tower.
Is that right?
Which Yeah, which has happened in the last couple of years. So it just seems to be that every sort of European iconic landmark now is being geared up and transformed into this awful barrier just to stand up or trying to resist this anticipated terrorist activity that they just haven't. We've got Cressida Dick, who's absolutely useless. We've got a useless mayor. It's just they've got no...
Well, these are your opinions, Richard. But we do, I mean, you know, I suppose it's the job of the government to protect us from terrorism, even though some would argue they've caused it.
Well, absolutely. And you know what? The guy that sent the last text message into you with regard to the safety of the politicians, I quite like the idea of the MPs that have to walk out of those gates at Parliament and walk down the street like everybody else has to, and they can have that little sense of fear that they have to look over their shoulder, because a lot of them have got such a ridiculous attitude towards what's going on in this country, and who's being allowed in and who's allowed to just simply just get away with this nonsense and preach it and support it and turn a blind eye to it. Sadiq Khan, really, he should have a lot more focus onto who's doing this and what the security service. I know the security services are under a lot of pressure, but there's just too much of it, and the solution isn't to change.
Why don't we deal with the problem, Richard, rather than let's deal with the cause and not the symptom? Maybe is the answer. Richard, I have to tell you, most MPs walking out of Parliament into the street would have little to fear, because no one knows who any of them are anymore, because they are a nondescript, dull, careerist bunch, and they're, on the whole, there are exceptions, pretty useless. So thank you very much indeed for your call. You said on LBC that you can't travel on the London Underground because of your personal safety. What kind of society have we become? Well, I'm afraid that's been the case with me for 4 or 5 years. I think anybody that is high profile, anybody that is famous, has to think twice about what they do in public. Unfortunately, folks, and this is a separate debate, but some of the left in this country believe not just that they are correct in their point of view, but those with a different opinion should not only not be allowed to have it, but that they are evil. And that is where we have got to. And it's horrible, it's hateful, but hey, it's a different problem. Parliament Square is not being pedestrianised to protect me. Of that, I have no doubt. But is it not an overreaction from Sadiq Khan? I think it is. Anthony is a brand new caller from Camden. Good evening.
Oh, hi, Nigel. Hi.
So, is it sensible? Is Sadiq Khan, is he doing the practical thing, or is he just overreacting?
I think it's absolutely practical. As an ex-soldier myself, you need to target hard, and you need to make sure that you're not exposing anything to chance. So let's say this guy that drove into these pedestrians, let's say it wasn't just a vehicle he was driving, it was a vehicle packed with explosives.
Yeah.
These are the things that we need to think about, and they're saying like, oh, he's and stuff like that.
Anthony, I get that point. But there are others, way before you and I had this conversation, that have thought about it as well. If you look at that huge barrier that the Ford Fiesta was crushed by yesterday, it is, I would guess, 40 yards at least from the entrance to the House of Lords. I mean, haven't we put realistically enough protection in place already, whilst at the same time trying to allow normal life to go on?
Nigel, you can never put enough protection in place. Unfortunately, we live in a nanny state, and there's never...
Well, I don't want to, Anthony. I don't want to live in a nanny state. I'm sick of the nanny state.
Neither do I.
I'm sick of being told what I can and can't do and where I can go. I'm bored with it, Anthony.
But I'm just saying, for instance, let's say this guy had... for instance, I don't know how to describe it, but a 50k explosive in this vehicle he was driving. Yep. He drove up to the people, he hit them, and then he detonated it. We're not talking about a couple of people being injured.
But Anthony, he could have done that. He could have done that a mile down the road. He could have done that 2 miles down the road.
You got to trust in MI5 to make sure they're doing the job well.
I'll tell you what, Anthony, and I'm going to say this, and no doubt get absolutely mullered for saying so and slagged off for saying so, but had a 50k bomb gone off in that car yesterday, would it have caused death and destruction? Yes. Would it have significantly damaged the Palace of Westminster? No. You know, and those barriers are put up to protect an iconic landmark. Above all, that's what they're doing. When it comes to protecting human beings against suicide bombers, the truth of it is, Anthony, there isn't actually much we can do, is there?
No, there's not that much we could do, but again, we need to protect. That statement you just made, I actually hope you do get mullered, because human lives matter. But there's also one more thing.
Anthony, I wasn't saying they don't, but I was arguing that if a terrorist wants to cause harm to human life, there are plenty of street markets, there are plenty of places in London within a mile or 2 miles of the Palace of Westminster where they could go and do it.
Absolutely, but these people, they want to make a point. That's why they would choose Parliament. This is the foundation of democracy.
So, Anthony, you know? If we... OK, all right, OK, let me go with your thread of argument. All right? We don't want to take the risk of Parliament being severely damaged, right? So we pedestrianise Parliament Square. We then have to do the same, presumably, to Buckingham Palace, yeah?
Yes, I assume so,
OK. Lambeth Palace, where the Archbishop of Canterbury lives?
Well, I mean, Nigel, come on.
Well, why not? It's a medieval castle.
If it needs to be done, then it needs to be done. That's why we've got a threat level, you know. So if somewhere,
but Anthony, where does this? But Anthony, where? I mean, look, I understand the point you're making, but where would this? Where would it end? I mean, would we finish up banning all vehicles from London?
Of all these people in this country that hates this country. You know, I'm originally from the Caribbean, and it's totally off subject, but I don't get why, and this is personal to me. There are people who are naturalized in this country who they have no love, no bearing, no understanding, nothing like that of what it means to be British. You know, and coming from the Caribbean, I could actually say that, you know, the Queen or colonialism has shaped us to understand what being British is. You know, so I definitely don't get people who are not from the Commonwealth.
So, Anthony, as somebody from the Caribbean who's become British, would you agree with me that, and it won't solve all of it, but one of the things we absolutely have to do is to make sure that people who are immigrants to this country can potentially become part of our society?
100%, absolutely. Absolutely. But they need to have the foundation in understanding what means to become British.
Yeah, and that would be dealing. That would be dealing not with the symptom but the cause. And with you, Anthony, with that, I'm 100% with you. Thank you. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 7:30. And are we really going to pedestrianise Parliament Square because some nut job drives a Ford Fiesta into the barriers outside the House of Lords? Well, Sadiq Khan seems to think so. Though, to be fair, he has argued that point for some years, and today made political points against Boris Johnson, who's always opposed it. I still feel it is an overreaction and not the right thing to say today. And actually, if we're going to stop cars driving around landmarks in London, I've got to tell you, folks, I travel around London by car every day. It's a nightmare already. Goodness knows what this would lead to. Before I get back to that, Gordon Brown, remember him? He was the Prime Minister of this country for some time, and he today has been at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and he was asked a question. Did he think Jeremy Corbyn was a fit and proper person to become the next Prime Minister? Now, bear in mind, the last 2 nights we've debated this very, very heavily, and Corbyn is in some trouble. He's in some trouble, not just because he went to the Palestinian Martyrs' Cemetery, but because he kept changing his story and looking insincere. And what former PM Gordon Brown says is there is a problem within the Labour Party with anti-Semitism, and he says Jeremy Corbyn has got to change. He cannot sustain, particularly what he is saying about the international agreement on what to do in our attitudes towards both the Holocaust and Israel. I predict to you that it's going to change within a few weeks, but I believe that even that change will not be enough. So the new hard-left Labour Party is being deserted by virtually everybody from those successful governments, successful elections at least, in 97, 2001, and indeed in 2005. Right, are we going to pedestrianise Parliament Square? I think that would be flying the flag of surrender from Big Ben once it's finally had all the scaffolding taken down from it. David says on Facebook, no, don't pedestrianise, get rid of the problem, don't bow to the terrorists, don't punish the public, punish the reasons behind it. Baron says, I'm sorry, Nigel, but where is all the money coming from for all this security? I thought the NHS was still struggling for funds, or maybe I've missed something. Baron, you're right. There are lots of priorities for government. Of course there are. But the primary role for government is to protect the integrity of the nation and its citizens. And I think, Baron, truth is, that becomes before absolutely everything else. And I genuinely believe that. If you think I'm wrong, call 0345 6060 973. Scott says, what about stadiums, restaurants and public transport? How do we further protect them? Scott, I think the logical answer is we close everything down entirely in London, and perhaps then Birmingham and Manchester and Glasgow and Swansea and goodness knows where else. Angela is a new caller from Manchester. Good evening, Angela. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So do you, I mean, look, you know, you in that city last year suffered the most abominable terrorist attack. It was truly shocking in every way. What happened yesterday was nowhere near, thank goodness, that order. Do you think Sadiq Khan's response was proportionate or not?
No, it was over the top. We should not pedestrianise London at all. And there's one thing I want to say is the police said they had no knowledge of this chap from the Sudan.
No, I think, Angela, can I just correct you slightly? The intelligence services had no knowledge of him. He wasn't on the list of 23,000 people that they're worried about, but the police did have knowledge of him. I don't know how or why. I've got to be careful about this, but clearly he's done something wrong at some point.
Yes. Well, what I wanted to say was, I'm a Conservative voter, but this Conservative government has let those people back in that went to fight in Syria.
Over 400 of them, yeah.
Yes, they came back. Now, does it take a brain box for them to get somebody that isn't really well known to the intelligence services to do something like this? Niggle away. And I'm finding that I have no faith left in this government.
But Angela, Angela, let me just ask you this. If you're worried, and by the way, I find it unbelievable that cabinet ministers have sanctioned drone strikes on British citizens to kill them when they're in Syria, and yet the next day when they come back, that's absolutely fine and dandy, and I've discussed that many times on this show. But Angela, would you feel more reassured with a Jeremy Corbyn government?
No, because what's happening at the moment is most of the Labour Party want to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. A lot of the Conservative Party want to get rid of Theresa May because of all the splits.
It's a right mess, Angela, isn't it?
They haven't got the courage to follow through with a true Brexit. But, so where does that leave us? Someone like Vince Cable to come in the middle? No.
Angela, you're moving on from this issue to discussing the great political crisis. And by the way, tonight's not the night for that, but I do agree with you. I cannot think of any point in my lifetime when both the so-called major parties were in as much crisis with their own traditional voters. Angela, I thank you very much indeed for your call. I get on SMS, you can pedestrianise a whole city, but the terrorists will always find a way to terrorise. It will be a huge white flag. You won this one to the terrorists, says Catherine from South Wales. Catherine, I agree. I mean, look, you know, Cressida Dick today said that the motor car had become the primary means of delivering terrorism. But hey, there are many, many other methods too. We must not fly the white flag of surrender. That's my view. What does Gerard, a new caller from Fulham, make of all this? Good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. Thanks a lot. I'm one of the 17.4 that voted to leave the bloated European Union, so I salute you. Thanks.
Yes, well, that's so you were probably feeling quite depressed before the attack yesterday, then.
Well, I believe one of the founding fathers, I think it was Benjamin Franklin, said that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Talking of the white flag, you're going to have a black flag flying there. I'm a licensed London taxi driver. I was one of the youngest taxi drivers to get his licence in 1984. I was just 21 and a half, and I love my city. And I really weep when I see what the subsequent mayor and the other ones have done to this city. Where he's going to get 300 million quid from to then dig up the square and all the traffic chaos when he said he hasn't got enough money for police. What he should do, instead of bowing down to these terrorists, because every time there is a terrorist attack, we get out the tea candles and put on Oasis, look back in anger and say, oh, I'm so sorry, these come from underprivileged places.
Oh, yes, and we're all solidarity, Gerard. We're all united together, aren't we? It's wonderful.
And he keeps saying, it's not going to change the British way of life. We've got to step up a lip. I'll tell you, Mr. Khan, Mr. Hayden Sadiq Khan, because he only pops up when there's something really of any relevance going on. What you need to do is get out on the street and see what damage that you have done to the infrastructure on the roads by and he's now weaponising Oxford Street. He's gone back to Westminster Council today, of all days, when, we don't even know who this bloke is, and asked them to reconsider pedestrianising Oxford Street.
Gerard, what is amazing, 36 hours on from the attack, is actually how little we know about this guy.
Exactly. And this is a knee-jerk reaction from Mr. Khan. We've seen it before. He doesn't like not getting his own way, and he'll use anything. He'll weaponise this situation. It's terrible. But, it's terrible what's happened. I'm sorry for the cyclists and people who got shot and everything else.
Yes, of course.
You cannot, listen, my parents lived through the Second World War. My father, they're both dead now. They were telling me that the Germans were dropping 1,000-pound bombs all over Chelsea and Fulham.
And life carried on.
And we had the milkman deliver the next day.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely farcical that this man could close Parliament Square, because it will lead up Whitehall, Trafalgar Square, Regent Street, Piccadilly. If you want, just put spikes in the road, Mr. Khan, and have done it. You hate the car, you hate the cab driver, and this bloke will probably get less than what Tommy Robinson's going to get when he gets out.
Gerard,
he'll have some left-wing lawyer on his side.
Spoken like a true London black cab driver. Thank you for your call. You always get strong opinions from London. I believe you, because whenever I get in them, they kind of know who I am, and they always put me straight, I've got to tell you. Nigel, even if they pedestrianised the whole of London, it still would not stop a determined terrorist, I get on SMS. And you're absolutely right. Much as it galls me to agree with you, I agree. If we pedestrianise Parliament Square, we're admitting defeat. However, we have already pedestrianised one side of Trafalgar Square, not far from this building, and the Victoria Memorial without issue. So why not the same for Parliament Square? Neil, there may be arguments, safety arguments. I mean, the north end of Trafalgar Square, and by the way, getting round Trafalgar Square now is a nightmare, but I can sort of see with the National Gallery and huge numbers of pedestrians and street displays and demos in Trafalgar Square, there may well have been a logical reason for closing that road. But my worry, Neil, is that this debate is happening in response to a pretty much failed terrorist attack. Seems to me the barriers and security that were put in place in Westminster worked. Not only was the Ford Fiesta crushed as it hit the barrier, but the armed response units were there within basically seconds. And you can't, however worried you are about the threats we face, you can't fundamentally change our whole way of life. Because if you do, Neil, then the terrorists actually have won. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 7:45. So the Mayor of London wants to pedestrianise Parliament Square for fear of terrorist attacks, and the Chief of the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dick, does nothing to contradict that. I think we are flying a white flag. Some people think it could ultimately be the black flag of ISIS. I think we're giving in. I don't think we can afford to do this. If we do it in Parliament Square, it's Buckingham Palace next. It's Piccadilly Circus after that, and goodness knows what. That is my view. Chris is a brand new caller to this show. He lives in Cardiff. Good evening.
Hello, Nigel. Yes, thank you for taking my call.
Welcome.
Yes,
One question. Do you think Mayor Sadiq Khan is acting in the best interests of the citizens of London? Do you think he's a good man, a man of integrity?
I think that Sadiq Khan is somebody who overreacts to situations, who is always overtly political, hence his dig at Boris when he talked about this earlier on today. And I think Sadiq Khan... Chris, I don't think he's a bad person, if that's what you're asking me. I've always actually got on with him personally rather well. Chris, I think he's plain wrong on this. I think he wants to fly a white flag, and that's a mistake. That's my view.
OK, given the situation, the attacks that happened last year, and it was so easy for someone, as you term them, nut jobs, OK, for some person to drive a vehicle at speed into pedestrians, and today, you know what, today they were just lucky. They were lucky. And the response of the police was, it's absolutely top. But this could happen tomorrow, next week, next month. What do you do? It's very tricky to call.
Well, but Chris, my point is, do you give in?
I don't call it giving in. I'd call it reacting. Look at the situation in Northern Ireland, where they had to protect police stations. I know it's not exactly the same, but these people, they go on the internet. These are vulnerable individuals, right, who receive this poison, and then they go out. Look at the guy from Cardiff last year who drove down and attacked the mosque. He was a Cardiff. He was not an immigrant. He was a national. But he was, as you say, okay, it's crude to put it, but a nut job. He was
well, I mean, Chris, it may well turn out, when we get more information tomorrow, that Sally Cutter was the suspect was a huge convert to radical Islamism, and that was his motivation, and some would say that was the likely case. But I just think, Chris, even though I've warned about this more than anybody probably, about the risks of terrorism and the risks that were happening with the fracturing of our society, I just think the way we're behaving, Chris, today is an overreaction.
I think we're in a very bad place, and I don't know what the answers are, but I would say, regarding the protection of Parliament, and, that's the heart of democracy, look at that MP who came to the aid of the stabbed policeman last year. And
I remember.
We're in a very bad place, and I don't know what the answers are.
Well, Parliament, Chris, Parliament was very, very weak. And when that happened, when the policeman was killed, the truth of it was, if Michael Fallon's, who was then Defence Secretary, personal close protection had not had a gun, that guy could have got actually pretty close to the House of Commons chamber. So there were some pretty serious security lapses, Chris. I would argue that we have closed those gaps. And the worry, Chris, is this. If our Parliament and our politicians are seen to be completely beyond our reach, because we've wrapped the whole of Westminster in cotton wool, Chris, my worry is that damages the whole democratic relationship between the governors and the governed even more than it already is.
It's a very hard thing to call. It's just very, very difficult. And we're in a very bad place. And 700 ongoing investigations.
I know. Chris, you and I would agree with that. 686 ongoing current investigations. All we can do, Chris, it seems to me, is to resource our services, to resource our intelligence people as much as we possibly can. Chris, thanks for the call. I'm going to move on. Others want to have a word. Stephen, who's calling from northwest London, wants to have a word. Stephen, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me on.
So do we ban cars from London, Stephen? I mean, Sadiq Khan may take us there.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's very hard to add to everything that's been said because the amount of sense that has been spoken on the program is incredible.
Good.
I think what is interesting, this guy clearly had no hope with the sort of car he was driving. There was no arms in it, so really the Westminster was just the theatre or the stage, if you like, where he wanted this to happen, and he thought he'd take a few people out on the way, if you like. So, like you say, this could happen anywhere.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the only answer is, it's the people that have allowed it to get to this state. They've had their time, they've had their chance, they've failed miserably. Maybe they should start paying. Maybe Sadiq can start putting people returning from ISIS from the other countries. He can start putting them up in his house and paying for them, looking after them. And everything.
I mean, isn't this, Stephen? Isn't this? I mean, Stephen, this. And I've referred to this again and again and again over the last 20 months that LBC have accommodated me here, and I keep on saying, how can it be? How can it be that our Labour and Conservative parties have allowed over 400 people who fought for ISIS in Syria back into our country? It's madness, Stephen, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe there should be a tax on the people that are into them coming here in the first place, and they should pay a tax. Because if they're into it, then fine, you pay for it.
You've got to get... goodness only knows. So, Stephen, we don't pedestrianise Parliament Square, is that right?
Pedestrianise. No, absolutely not.
Thank you very much indeed for your call. Hang on, I got on Twitter. Even if it was a terrorist attack, the perpetrator did not get past the barrier. So, isn't that proof the security in place is adequate and so no need to pedestrianise, says Marty on Twitter. Marty, you've summed up beautifully some of the arguments I've been trying to make tonight. What's been put in place worked. That car came to stop a good 40 yards from the Piers entrance of the House of Lords. What was put in place worked, it seems to me, and we should not panic and we should not overreact. James says, don't pedestrianise, as it would cause so much traffic getting around Parliament Square. Only cyclists would be allowed onto Parliament Square. Well, some mornings, James, it looks like there are only cyclists there anyway, because such is the trend now, to travel around London by bike. Not a trend that I've caught on to myself. Maybe Fred, a new caller from the City of London, has a view on bicycles versus cars. Fred, good evening.
Good evening. On bicycles versus cars, I think cars are with us and will always be with us to stay. And Sadiq is an enemy of cars. And,
yes, isn't he?
He is. And this is just another excuse to ply his agenda. But on the matter of security, I don't believe we should be pedestrianising Parliament Square. Getting really tired, actually, of people saying, like Cressida Dick, saying we will not be cowed and our lifestyles are not going to change. These bollards and concrete blocks are not things of beauty. Historically, the best wall and the best security for England has been the English Channel. And
well, that's certainly true. Absolutely.
We did our jobs right, and we've got good security forces and everything. So long as we had the will, we should have a relatively easy time keeping bad guys out and ferreting out and stopping the radicalization that's going on in the country.
We're going to have to be quite robust, Fred, aren't we?
Well, we will, but I think the important thing is to have the political will. And I'm not so sure it's there.
No, I think, Fred, and again, we've touched on this again and again in the last hour. We're too busy talking about the symptoms of the problem and not the cause. Fred, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Well, some strong, strong passions there. We should never change our ways. How weak would we look, says Ian. Ian, to some extent, just go through an airport. I will be tomorrow morning. We've already, to some extent, changed our ways. But a sense of perspective, please, and perhaps a rather sombre note to end on. Decorator Dave says, here, Nigel, if you want to talk terrorist attacks, let's not forget the 20th anniversary of the 29 lives lost in the Omar bombing. Some of these feeble Fiesta attacks pale into insignificance in comparison to what happened in Northern Ireland over many, many years. And I agree, Dave, we should not forget some of the abominable things that happened there within the United Kingdom.